Good? Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. It looks as if we have a quorum here, and the entire... Do we do a roll call?
Vice President Narducci.
Here.
Vice President Narducci.
Here.
Member Kay.
Here.
Member Taylor.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. So we're gathered here to talk about the appeals, and this is the Appeals Committee, and I'll turn some time over to our director, Alicia Williams.
Good afternoon, Vice President Narducci, members of the Appeals Committee. Deputy Director Ketcher Baden will be leading today's discussion.
And you are so dressed for the occasion. Thank you for wearing a tie and a white shirt. Wow, a suit and everything.
Mr. Chair, members, only the best for you. So this is the Atf Appeals Committee. We have a few things on the agenda today, but I just want to go over some of the just basic duties in charge of this committee and the policies and procedures surrounding the Atf appeals process. And then we'll talk about some of the appeals that the board received, give you some sort of high-level information on those, and then potentially take some action. Before we even get started, though, I do want to just outline the idea behind today's meeting is to evaluate which appeals that were filed are within the committee's scope and which are outside of the committee's scope. So on the agenda today, we don't anticipate any actual evaluations of the appeals or scoring or rubrics or anything like that. This is really just the first step as an organizational meeting to sort of get on the same page on where we're at, and then to decide which appeals this committee can take a closer look at and potentially weigh in on and issue a recommendation, and which appeals, based on the board's policies and procedures, are outside of its scope. So with that, with agenda item 1, there's some information on there on the executive summaries that have been provided. I'll give you just some brief background. At the June meeting, the board created this committee and established the policies and procedures governing the Atf appeals process. The structure of the committee is attached to that first item, as well as the policies and procedures governing the Atf appeals process. I also included, there's a couple paragraphs there in the executive summary that's pertinent to today's discussion, which is around which appeals are within the committee's scope and that the committee is allowed to evaluate, and which are very specifically the committee does not have authority on. So you can see that the grounds for an appeal are environmental issues or events, school or community emergency, school tragedy, or other similar substantive events. And then the appeals conditions that are not allowable under the policies and procedures are, in some cases, pretty specific, but also including but not limited to those that are listed, including opposition to the formula, the demographic makeup of the student population, data within the control of the school, individual student characteristics, and statistical computations. Before we go any further, the policies and procedures about what's appealable is largely modeled after the appeals process that was under the old accountability system that was previously housed under the Department of Education. So what's appealable and what is not appealable is largely modeled off of that system, as well as the rubric, which is not included in here because we're not doing any grading today. But those were largely used as mirrored based on that old process. I also just want to reiterate, when we're talking about appeals for this Atf Appeals Committee, these are the appeals that were filed during the period of Thursday, September 28th to October 6th. That was the window that was established by the board pursuant to those policies and procedures. There was a subsequent period called the data encoding validation period, where schools could submit data encoding concerns about how their letter grades were calculated, which would fall under that statistical computation period. Those have been handled by the board and forwarded to the department for review. But I just want to make sure that we're clear that when we're talking about appeals, we're talking about the window that was open during that time and which had policies and procedures governing them, not necessarily that subsequent data encoding validation period, though there's some overlap, which I'll get into later. So during that window, there were 71 appeals that were filed. Board staff analyzed those appeals that were filed during that window and determined that 60 of them were citing events or factors that were outside of this committee's scope. And the broad events or factors sort of grouped into some categories that came up after analyzing the appeals that's listed on that first table. And then 11 schools cited events that board staff determined were within the committee's scope. And then those are listed there. And actually, there's even more specifics on which those 11 schools are on item 3, which is later in the agenda. We can get into more details on that. And then 24 of the appeals, 24 of those 71 appeals, were automatically forwarded to the Department of Education as part of that data encoding validation period that I described. There was just an administrative decision made that rather than making those schools reapply if they cited data or coding issues in their appeal, the board would simply forward those along as part of that appeals process, as part of that validation process. So that's sort of the high-level information on the appeals window and what schools filed with those appeals. There's also a spreadsheet that's attached that gives some information on those. The spreadsheet in your packets is on the last page and was provided ahead of time as well. And that gives some sort of high-level information on the schools that filed and what their final letter grade request was. There's a column there that says mitigating factors cited. Those are the factors, one of those 4 factors that a school could choose to file an appeal under. And then data encoding review, if there's a Y, or a Y indicates that that was a school that was forwarded to ADE as part of the data encoding validation period. And then that last column is board staff's analysis and recommendation on the appeals that are within the scope. And if you don't have that, then I think we have some extra copies.
I don't think it's in the packet, but I just pulled mine up online.
I'm trying to get to mine.
It took a while, didn't it?
And the ones that were provided ahead of time also had some additional notes. I think some notes that sort of fit into these categories that we recognized as trends. It should be on the last page of that packet.
Well, I found, Catcher, thank you. Just a comment. I found it very helpful. I found the stuff you sent, the Excel spreadsheet, as well as the summaries that were sent beforehand from you, Alicia, and the staff, was very helpful for us to not have to read all of the appeals, for one, and to two, get a succinct picture of what was going on, and to synthesize all the information down to what we actually have to deal with. And I know we have had a previous conversation in that some of the appeals, depending on what we're doing with the TAC and various issues that can come down into the future, with respect to the ADFs, some of this may have been too soon in light of where we are and where the tax approaches to stuff as well. But I think the synthesizing and organization and narrowing it down to the 11 or so that actually fall within true appeal processes, what we need to deal with. So thank you. So where do we go from here?
Mr. Chair, members, so item 2 is so item 1 was just information only so we can get an idea of where we're at. Item 2 is the action item that would determine that those 60 appeals that board staff identified as outside of the scope of this committee are therefore not eligible to be evaluated by this committee because it's not within its jurisdiction. So if there aren't any questions, then we would recommend making that motion that's listed under the recommendation for the committee under item 2. And also, just for the record, I want to also mention that you were provided the appeals themselves to review too, if perhaps you had disagreements with staff's analysis.
Thank you, Catcher. Committee members. Any discussion?
Vice President Narducci, I do have a question. So on the appeals that were determined to be a data-related issue and forward to ADE, did those schools cite the data, and that's what led to that? Because there was at least one appeal that I read. It was hard for me to tell whether it was a data issue or not, and it didn't appear to be forwarded on. So how was that decision made?
Mr. Chair, Member Kay, so largely it was the data or coding issue identified an issue with how the letter grade was calculated? Was it identifying data discrepancies? So maybe the school is seeing a certain number of students tested, but ADE reported out another, or perhaps the school did their own calculation of how their letter grade should have came out and found it came out differently than what ADE identified. That was sort of the threshold for whether or not it was a data or coding issue. If there was a specific appeal, without seeing the specific appeal, I don't know about that specific case, but that was sort of the determination that was made on board staff's part.
Okay. I think I understand the difference. There were just a couple that when I went through it in my mind, it's hard to tell, is this I don't agree with the formula issue, or it was a data issue. So I will certainly leave it in board staff's hands. I'm not sure that I understand all of the nuances of each case well enough to make that call.
So, thank you. Question, two questions from that though. One is, are we comfortable that the folks that did appeal actually were clear and knew what the process to appeal, and they understood? That's one question.
Vice President Narducci, members of the committee, that is correct. People were aware of the reasons why they could appeal, and they were also aware of the processes that board staff took after the appeal. Going forward into like the data encoding validation that the board opened, I think a lot of schools were excited for that opportunity to submit that data and the coding concerns that they had, because they knew within the first appeals process they weren't able to do so. You did have schools that took liberties and submitted anyways, so we wanted to make sure that we took, which I believe was 24 of those schools, and pass it on to the department to work with those schools individually to analyze the differences between their data.
Thank you. And then the second question is, after a decision of this committee is made, procedurally, I'm uncertain as to what the next steps are with respect to where those schools go from here, if at all.
Mr. Chair, members, if the committee would make recommendations to the full board for consideration. So any recommendation or any action that this board takes really is not finalized until the board sort of puts its stamp of approval on it. So for committees or for schools that filed appeals, perhaps those 11 schools, they would come in and have their time if they wanted to. If they selected a non-expedited appeal, they would have their 15 minutes. The committee could evaluate and then issue a recommendation on whether or not they recommend changing the letter grade based on that appeal. That school would still be listed as under review on the public file like they are right now until the board takes an action and either ratifies and agrees with that recommendation or perhaps takes another course of action, which is within the board's purview. After the board takes that action, that letter grade would then be changed publicly in the public file from under review to whatever the recommended letter grade is and what the board ratified.
Okay. Thank you. I've got one more question now. So if the TAC comes back with some things that were found in their review that the board wishes to consider further, and somehow potentially grades for various schools, including the schools that we have on appeal, are impacted one way or another, are the folks that have already appealed still able to appeal whatever happens as a result of how we treat the TAC suggestions? Is there a waiver or anything that they're not in any way prejudiced, are they? They still have the opportunity to, if we have to reopen things because of TAC suggestions, these folks are not prejudiced and they could still appeal in the future?
President or Vice President Narducci, members of the committee, this appeals process was established by the board for this round or for the preliminary letter grades. The board itself would have to set up a secondary round of appeals based upon any outcome, based upon any data outcome that the TAC may come up with. I think for item 2, these schools submitted an appeal which was outside of the scope that was set for the board. So that is why the recommendation would be to not evaluate these appeals.
Thank you. Any other conversation or comments or questions?
I have one more question, Vice President Narducci, Member Taylor. So if we decide that these appeals are outside of the scope and they're not eligible for appeal, the preliminary grades that they were issued that are under review, would those then become public at that point?
Mr. Chair, Member Kay, it would have to take board action for that to happen first, and I think staff might recommend, we'll be talking about this later with item 3 with those 11 schools, but staff may recommend holding off on recommending changing any of these from under review to a letter grade publicly until the 16-17 letter grades are a little more finalized. Just in case, just to allow for a little more flexibility on this committee's part and on the board's part in light of where we're at in terms of the review and revision process for 16-17.
Okay, thank you.
Jared, anything?
I think you covered it.
Okay.
I mean, my question was similar to yours, is how does it all fit together in terms of the process? I'm trying to put a little flow chart in my head, but I think I got it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So ready for a motion? Can we hear a motion?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I move that the Atf Appeals Committee determine the 60 appeals listed in the attached cited events or factors that are outside the scope of the Atf Appeals Committee and will therefore not be evaluated by the Atf Appeals Committee.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
No opposed. Thank you. Next.
Mr. Chair, members, item 3 sort of is the second part that we alluded to of this discussion regarding the remaining appeals, the 11 remaining appeals that are within this committee's scope. And we just talked about it with Member Kay and Member Taylor that in light of some of the reviews and revisions that are still undergoing with the 16-17 letter grade, rather than reviewing and evaluating these 11 appeals now and potentially issuing a recommendation while underlying changes to the letter grades may be happening, may not be happening, depending on the board's actions. Board staff is recommending that this committee delay review of those until such time that the letter grades are a little more finalized and we have confidence in the underlying data that has where those letter grades are currently.
Any discussion or comment?
No, Mr. President, Vice President. No, I agree. I think it's a good recommendation. Just to the point of a flow chart, I don't know if it'd be helpful when it does go to the board to just show them a picture. Mm-hmm. Like here's where it's come and here's how it's going to merge in with the larger board action that we're going to take in a week or so.
Vice President Narducci, Member Taylor, we can definitely work on that for the board.
Thank you.
Nice pictures and color.
Try.
Visuals help.
I will use my Crayola crayons.
That works.
Perfect.
Thank you, Jared. Can we have a motion then?
Mr. Vice President, Member Kay, I move that the Atf Appeals Committee delay the review and evaluation of the 11 substantive appeals listed until the board finalizes the 2016-2017 letter grades.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? None. Thank you. Anything else?
I think, Mr. Chair, members, we do have a call to the public, but we haven't received any request to speak forms, but I just wanted to make sure that we covered our bases there. And in terms of future meeting dates, we'll be in touch. As that last motion indicated, it might be a little ways until we get some more finalization of the 16-17 letter grades, and then we'll get up that process and we'll be in contact with the schools.
Great.
Can I just
Good,
make
Jared.
a comment there? So maybe let's talk a little bit about timing, because that might be something, Mr. Vice President, you need to consider. Just respect to my position here, my term is up, I think, on the 18th of January, and then the next January board meeting is after that. So I'm not sure if I'll be here, depending on the timing here and where my term is. So I'm happy to support and I'm happy to do whatever I can. But if the term is expired, then I may not. You may need a backup plan. I'll just toss that out, just because that might be a logistical issue. I don't want us to have a surprise.
Good. And let me ask a question of that. Do terms just expire, or is it? Do you serve until there's a replacement? How does that work on this committee, on this board?
I've seen it both ways.
Me
but
too.
Maybe the
That's what I was
executive
wondering.
director might be able to.
Vice
elaborate.
President Narducci, members of the board serves at the pleasure of the governor. So if the governor's office appoints a new person prior to the other member leaving,
Expiration of the term.
the expiration of the term, then that new person would be placed in. Like Member Taylor said, I have seen it both ways, where there is not an appointment, therefore that person just continues to serve until that person is either reappointed by the governor or a new person is appointed.
Okay. So can I make a consideration that I think we have a few members or a couple of members that are in the same boat as Member Taylor? And if you could speak with the governor's office and let them know that we would like to have them to continue in their service until there actually is an appointment, that would be much better for us. And if they wish to reappoint them, that's fine with me too.
We win either way.
Yeah. Because we have a lot going on, and we don't want to be cut short, as you know.
Vice President Narducci, members, I will have that conversation for you.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Can we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Seconded?
Second.
All in favor? Thank you.
Aye.
We're adjourned, and happy Thanksgiving.